The Ultra Orthodox Haredi community in Israel went to protest in Jerusalem against what they see as a potential destruction in the world of Torah, as they call it, or in other words, to fight once again against the possibilities that their kids will be required to serve in the military like most other Jewish Israelis for 2 to 3 years. I am Itay, I am a tour guide here in Israel, and today I invite you to join me as we explore a fascinating question. How is it that for most of Israel's 77 years, the Ultra Orthodox, the Haredis as they are called in Hebrew, have been exempted from the military service? What changed now, and what could the future hold for one of the deepest and most burning social debates in the Israeli society? Israel was established in 1948, and from the very beginning, and much before really, it was clear that Israel has to acquire a strong, determined and sophisticated military to be able to deal with the many potential threats in the region. Thus, a compulsory military service was legislated right after the War of Independence. The law was theoretically for every Israeli citizen, but in practice, not really. The Arab community in Israel was exempted from the very beginning, and that's how it stayed until today. Arabs in Israel can volunteer to join the IDF, and some do, but they don't have to. For example, the most famous unit of Israeli Arabs are the Bedouin trekkers of the Desert Reconnaissance Battalion. These guys has an expertise in reading the terrain, trekking, and on almost each patrol on the borders you will find one of them. There are two exemptions to the Arab exemption from the military. The Druze community that right after the establishment of Israel decided, under the leadership of Sheikh Amin Tarif, that their men will also serve as a compulsory military service, and the small Cherkessian community. And what's with the Ultra-Orthodox? Even before the establishment of the country, some rabbis, including the chief Ashkenazi rabbi at the time, Yitzhak Herzog, the father of former President Chaim Herzog and the grandfather of the current president, Yitzhak Herzog, went to Ben-Gurion and asked him to exempt the Haredi yeshiva students from service because of the destruction of most yeshivas in Europe during the Holocaust. Ben-Gurion agreed and limited the number of exemptions to 400 individuals. Later the number was changed to 800 and kept growing, but during those years there was always Haredis that also served in the army. Some studied and were exempted, and some did service. That changed in 1977 when Menachem Begin won the elections, and as a part of his coalition agreements to enter the ultra-Orthodox parties to his government, especially the Agudat Israel party, he agreed to cancel the limitations of the yeshiva students exempted from service. And that, my friends, is where the party started. From that point onwards, almost no Haredis joined the army at all. As you may imagine, the general Jewish Israeli public that is required to full service, men and women, didn't like it and protested against it for decades. But nothing really changed. It actually got worse because in the beginning, some Haredis went to serve and it was just normal. But as time passed, most Haredis that went to the army were, in Haredi eyes, the fallouts, failures, the ones that didn't make it in the yeshiva, the religious schools, so instead they went to do that thing in the army. So while in the general Israeli Jewish society, military service was always seen as an important contribution that is highly respected, in the Haredi society, if a Haredi soldier went home wearing his uniform, he was mocked for it. And in some cases it would also stain the name of his family, which would make it more difficult for his siblings finding a match when they will decide to get married. In some places, caricatures portraying the Haredi soldiers as monsters coming to kidnap little kids were hanged on the walls around Haredi neighborhoods, and a slang slur were used against them, meaning light-headed Haredim. As you can imagine, in these circumstances, even if you are a Haredi boy who wants to join the IDF and serve, you know that both you and your family will pay the price and you won't do it. And how come I talk only about the Haredi boys? The IDF recruits women to almost every unit, including infantry, tanks, Air Force, and the Navy. But the Haredi community is very conservative in this sense. The Haredi rabbis were speaking very harshly against women military service, so it doesn't really happen. And if what I just said makes you think, who cares about what those rabbis say? they care a lot. For the Ultra Orthodox, the big rabbis are extremely revered. What they tell you to do or not to do is seen as a command you have to follow. But this is a topic for another video. So back to our story. How come we got to this point? How come nothing changed in nearly 50 years? To understand that, we need to explain the structure of the Israeli political system. When Israeli voters are going to the poll, they vote for a political party, and in the end of the election day, each party that got at least the minimum votes needed to get into the parliament gets a certain number of seats out of the 120 parliament seats. Then, the head of the largest party, well, not necessarily, but that is usually the case, needs to form a coalition of at least 61 seats in order to have a majority. So, that person has to bring more political parties into his coalition. For almost all the prime ministers since the days of Menachem Begin and until today, it was relatively easy to work and form coalitions with the Ultra Orthodox parties, both from the left and from the right sides of the Israeli political map. Why? Because honestly, they don't really care about much outside of their own communities. The main interest that they have is to get budgets for their schools, institutions, and to keep the youngsters outside of the military. And that approach worked, and worked really well. Every attempt to change the situation was delayed and prolonged. Most yeshivas and ultra-Orthodox schools continue to receive government funding, even if they don't teach the core subject required by the Ministry of Education. In fact, many of these schools are owned and operated by Haredi political parties themselves. And over the years, this system created an educational world almost completely independent from the state, yet still financed by it. And of course, the exemption from the military and national service continued. In other words, the ultra-Orthodox parties played the political game really well, while being focused on benefiting their communities and way of life, and creating a bubble that is almost in every way separated from the rest of the Israeli society, in education, in the military service, and to some extent also later on in the professional life. But now the situation is reaching once again to a boiling point because of three main reasons. The first one is a rapid growth in the percentage of the Haredi community in Israel. In 1950, they were less than 2%. In 1980, 5%. And today the Haredi community makes 14% of the Israeli society. This happens due to high birth rate. The average number of kids per Haredi woman is 6.4, while in the rest of the Israeli society it's 2.5 kids per woman. When the Haredi community was relatively small, it was easy for most Israelis to overlook the sense of injustice, the feeling that one group is playing by different rules. But as the community grew, that quiet tolerance simply began to fade. The second reason is October 7th. In the last 2 years, Israel faced its longest war so far. A war that started in the horrific attack on Israeli citizens by Hamas, continued in Gaza, then continued against Hezbollah and Lebanon, and eventually got all the way to Iran. And even though the war is officially over, still not all the bodies of the hostages are back, and there are still Israeli troops inside the Gaza Strip. Now, the Israeli military is relying on times like this on the reserve soldiers. The active military of the mandatory service is relatively small, and in times of need, the reserve soldiers are filling up the gaps to the needs of the war. People that are students in the middle of the semester, that already have families and jobs, and are leaving everything behind to go to fight the war. In peaceful times, a reservist would usually do 2 to 3 weeks of service per year, but during this war, some reservists did up to 500 days of service and more. There are kids that hardly saw their parents for hundreds of days. All of these reserve soldiers don't have to go. No one will make them. If someone says that it's too much and he has to spend more time with his family or go back to work because otherwise someone else will take his place, he or she will be released. And yet many reservists are going again and again because they feel it's important, and that if they won't go, then who will? And then they and everybody around them see the whole community that can serve and contribute in a real time of need, that can take weight off the reservists, and yet chooses not to do so. Moreover, that its representatives are key leaders in the current government that is receiving all the decisions about this war and at the same time fights for its voters not to serve. That made many Israelis very upset about the current situation. The third reason is bureaucracy. Until today, different governments legislated all sorts of laws that were supposed to help recruit the Haredis, but in practice were just tricks to delay it in a few more years. These laws always were made with a time limit, and when that expires, it was either prolonged or a new one was made instead. And in June 2024, that law expired. In an ordinary time, Netanyahu, the current prime minister, would probably make a new law to exempt the Haredis from military service easily. But now the situation is different. Inside Netanyahu's own government, there are deep misagreements about those who want to preserve Israel's ultra-Orthodox exemptions to those who say that there has to be a drastic change. Many of them, politicians in the Likud party and the religious Zionist party, know that their voters are angry on this issue and that it will have an effect in the coming elections. Bottom line, the government doesn't have the majority needed to legislate a new law, and without a law, they are obligated to recruit the ultra-Orthodox and implement sanctions on both individuals that are required to recruit and institutions that are financed by the government yet do everything in their power to stop their students from recruiting. So here we are. The government that is dependent on the ultra-Orthodox parties doesn't legislate against their recruitment. And to remind you, this is the basic deal between Netanyahu and the ultra-Orthodox parties. So what do? Not much. They threaten to make the government fall, but in practice they don't want to give up positions of power, and since they can't blame the government because they are the government, they blame Netanyahu, the religious Zionist party, for not legislating, but even more than that, they blame the judicial system for, well, keeping the law, which in their eyes is a betrayal in the real Jewish way of life that they hold. Last week, the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel arranged a large protest. They called it the 1 million protest, hoping for a huge demonstration, but in the end about 200,000 protesters came. I went there to film, and in my impression it was a large demonstration, but not unique in Israeli standards, especially compared to the many protests that took place in the last 3 years against the changes in the judicial system and later for a hostage deal. Let's look into some of the signs and messages that were there. Aryeh Deri, the leader of the Shas Haredi party, blamed for selling Haredi youngsters for power and money. A commitment that not even one will be recruited. Going to the army is a disaster and whoever is going there is spiritually done. Comparing a Haredi man that was arrested to the hostages in Gaza. Russia is here. The Attorney General of Israel is a witch. You get the idea. These guys imitated being handcuffed, saying that they are willing to go to prison but not to serve. The protesters represent the vast majority of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. However, there were always a few that decided to serve, and during the war, the IDF created a new infantry brigade called Hashmonians. It was designed specifically for the needs of the ultra-Orthodox soldiers. The training base, for example, doesn't have any women in it. Time is dedicated each day for study and prayer, and their service will continue to allow their unique needs. The first training of 150 ultra-Orthodox recently ended, and time will tell if this brigade will grow to a size of a full brigade or remain relatively small. So what does the future hold? In the coming year, there is going to be an elections that will determine where the country is going for the next few years. If in the next coalition they will include the ultra-Orthodox parties, then nothing much will change. And young ultra-Orthodox men will continue to follow the guidelines of the former Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, Yitzhak Yosef, that instructed them to take the recruitment letters and wash them down the toilet. If the next coalition will not include the ultra-Orthodox parties, then some big changes might happen. It's not that on a hot summer morning hundreds of buses will make their way from the ultra-Orthodox cities to the recruitment center in Tel HaShomer, more likely that the government will cut financing from institutions that promote the traditional of non-recruitment attitude, and sanctions will be implemented on individuals that will decide to ignore the recruitment letters. Then the incentive to go and serve both in the IDF and in national service in civil organizations will be much greater, and this may bring a real change. I am Itay. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, share your thoughts in the comment below. I'll see you in the next video and have a beautiful day.